Chapter 15 Coast Part 2. The Thieves' Guild watcher climbed up a gangplank leading onto a moored barge. A worn sign hung from a post beside the plank, displaying a painted sailing ship and the words, Low Lantern Tavern. Twilight carefully followed the watcher up the plank. It lacked railings or even a rope to grab if she slipped. The sound of water lapping against the hull of the barge emanated from below. She stepped off the gangplank and onto the deck of the barge. A few somber individuals sat around outdoor tables on the deck of the boat, nursing their mugs in the afternoon air. Her friends followed single file after her as she moved clear of the gangplank. The watcher lifted a hoof and pointed towards a table on the far side of the barge, his eyes shaded by his hood. "He's the one you'll want to talk to," he said. Twilight held up a foreleg to shield her eyes from the rays of the sun reflecting off the water. 3 ponies and a griffin played a quiet game of cards around the table. They peered carefully at their cards and eyed the pile of bits in the center.
"Which one?"
she asked the watcher. "The one with the hat," the watcher said before turning and heading back down the plank.
Hold on a second,
Twilight called after him, but he ignored her and slipped down an alley between 2 waterfront houses. She frowned and turned to Rarity.
Do Thieves' Guild ponies usually run off before anyone gets the chance to make sure they got what they paid for?
Rarity smiled.
Relax. They've got a reputation to keep. These ponies need to smile,
Pinky said, looking around the deck with disappointment. Twilight sighed and looked at the table again. Next to the griffin, she noticed a tricorn hat with a plume of purple feathers sitting beside the stack of bits. She walked toward the griffin, stepping around obstacles. Ahead, the griffin said, "All in," and pushed his pile of bits into the pot. With a smirk, he picked up his hat and placed it on his brown feathered head. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, radiating confidence. "I call," one of the ponies, a unicorn, said, adding his bits to the pot. Twilight stepped beside the table. She focused on the griffin.
"I need to speak with you."
The griffin opened one eye and looked up at her. "One moment, mademoiselle, I am winning," he said as he turned his cards over with a talon. The ponies stared at the cards in shock.
"You're cheating!"
she shouted. She pressed a leather bracer around her wrist against the table, and a blade shot out past her hoof as she began to rise out of her seat. A unicorn on the far side pulled a knife stuck into the table beside him free. The third slid out of his chair and started to back away. The 2 with weapons faced the griffin with menacing glares. Twilight drew Solstice and speared it into the center of the table, scattering the pot of bits. A mix of gold, silver, and copper coins scattered to the deck of the barge.
"I need the griffin. This game is over. Take your bits and go,"
she said, glaring at the 2 ponies with weapons.
"Who the hell are you?"
The pony with the switchblade asked as she turned towards Twilight and brandished her blade. In an instant, Rainbow's wing was at her throat.
"That's a nice weapon,"
she said. "Mine are better." The unicorn picked a few golden bits up off the floor and backed away. The pony dropped her hoof and pushed the switchblade into the deck of the ship, driving it back into its sheath.
All right, I'm leaving.
She swiped a collection of coins off the table and turned away. She spat onto the deck as she left. Twilight took a seat at the table while the griffin collected the rest of the bits. "Well, now that you've finished giving away my money to these uncultured swine, how may I help you?" the griffin said. Rainbow slammed her hoof down on the table.
"Hey, we just saved you, Featherface."
"Perhaps you did." One of the griffin's talons descended to a cutlass at his side. "Perhaps not." I do know that I won the game.
Did you cheat? Applejack asked.
The griffin held up a pair of claws with the tips almost touching. Perhaps little.
We're looking for 4 ponies who were carting around an egg-shaped object bigger than they were,
Twilight said.
I have it on good authority that you've seen them.
Bigger than one of them or all 4? The griffin asked. Twilight glared. I jest, he said, holding up his talons in a placating gesture. But if I did know something, it would be information about the client and bad form to share.
Client? For what?
Twilight asked. The griffin's eyes lit. He swept off his feathered hat and dipped his head. Captain Florent, at your service. He placed his hat back on his head and pointed across the water at a boat moored to a wooden pier a ways down the waterfront. That is my ship, Solitaire. Twilight eyed the vessel. The name painted along the side of its prow in flowy black script allowed her to pick it out from among the other boats moored to the pier. It was a small, single-masted ship. If it weren't for the fine finish and catamaran hull, it could be mistaken for a poor sailor's fishing boat crewed by perhaps 6 to 8 ponies.
So they paid you to take it somewhere? An island, maybe?
An island? Florent scoffed. He wrapped a limb around Twilight's shoulders, pulling her close. Mademoiselle, you are looking at the coast runner. Twilight pushed him off and shifted her chair away.
What are you talking about? You can't sail in the water near the Sword Coast,
she objected.
It's too dangerous unless you're in an armored carrack. And even then...
Florent gave her a knowing smile. If you were talking about any other ship, you'd be right. But in La Solitaire, it is completely safe.
Oh, and what's your little boat gonna do if a sea serpent decides it wants to have some fun?
Applejack asked, stepping between Twilight and Florent. He chuckled. A sea serpent could not catch her.
Doesn't having more sails make the boat faster?
Rainbow asked.
You've got 1 mast.
She's a ship, not a boat, and like any lady, she has her secrets, Florent said.
Speaking of secrets,
Rarity said, taking a seat beside Twilight.
Let's talk business. I'm sure you could be persuaded to tell us where you took them.
Florent eyed Rarity. What kind of persuasion are we referring to? Rarity produced a diamond.
The monetary kind. Is this enough?
Oui, that will do nicely, Florent said. Rarity passed the diamond across the table, and Florent snatched it out of the air with his talons. About a week ago, a pair of weird ponies come up to me and pay me in advance to transport 4 passengers and a small amount of cargo about a third of the way to Canterlot, Florent said. I say there's nothing on the coast there, but they pay, so I agree.
A third of the way to Canterlot,
Twilight muttered, picturing a map of the coast in her mind.
That's about where...
Florent held up a claw. Mademoiselle, I am telling a story. If you want to hear it, do not interrupt. He paused. When Twilight nodded an affirmative, he continued. Later that day, 4 ponies come with a cart loaded with an egg-shaped object beneath a sheet. We get it loaded and set sail. I take them to their destination and drop them off on the beach at the base of the cliffs beneath a place called Candlekeep. They had no wings, so I warn them that the cliffs there are too steep to climb, and the tide covers that beach completely. But they would not listen. The ponies you are looking for are dead. Drowned, frozen, or eaten, perhaps more. Pinky waved a hoof in the air.
Shh! You can get up and down there easily.
Twilight furrowed her brows and stared at the table.
Why would they go to... Wait,
she thought.
If they think I would go back there...
She turned and grabbed Florent's shoulder with a hoof.
We need to get to Candlekeep, now!
She cried. Florent smiled at her. Forward, I like that. It turns out I have the perfect ship to get you there. He pulled off his hat and puffed out his chest. Solitaire is at your service, mademoiselle, for the right price. Florent stopped on the dock in front of Solitaire's gangplank. Hold on a moment, he said. Protocol must be followed. Twilight stepped up beside him and gave him a questioning look.
Isn't it your ship, your rules?
This is a little embarrassing, he murmured. He dipped his head, hiding his face behind the brim of his hat, and hauled, "Permission to come aboard?" "Granted," Amir answered from somewhere on the ship. A moment later, a unicorn with a bleach blonde mane and a brown coat appeared on the deck beside the gangplank. She leaned on the ship's railing and looked over the group. "What have you got this time?" she asked. "Ladies first," Florent said, gesturing toward the gangplank. As Twilight stepped past, he held up a claw to hide his beak and said in a hushed voice, "This is Quick Fix. She likes to think she's in charge." "That's because I am in charge, Florent," Quick Fix said as she stepped in front of the plank. "Hold on. Do they have any cargo? We're almost full. 6 passengers is about all we can take."
"No cargo,"
Twilight said.
"Just us."
"Well then, welcome aboard," Quick Fix said, stepping aside. "I suppose you want to take a look at the boat? Trust me, you've gotten your money's worth." "She's a ship!" Florent protested. As Twilight climbed up the gangplank, Quick Fix rolled her eyes. Twilight stepped onto the deck and took a look around. The deck was wide for a ship of its length due to the dual-hulled design. A cabin rose from the stern, with the steering wheel positioned on the quarterdeck above it. The rigging for the single mast was relatively simple, leaving plenty of open space on the deck. A few crates were stacked against the guardrail near the prow and covered with a canvas tarp. Surprisingly, there were no other crew members.
"They must be ashore,"
she thought.
"That's going to be a problem."
"So, are you with us all the way to Canterlot?" Quick Fix asked them as the rest of the group came aboard.
"Nope, we're going to Candlekeep,"
Pinky said. "Candlekeep? You've got to be kidding." Quick Fix turned to Florent. "Please tell me we're not leaving another group to drown on a beach beneath the cliffs?" Florent shrugged. "Well, they say there's a way up. Besides, 2 of them are Pegasai. I'm sure they can figure it out." Twilight had no idea what Pinky was talking about as far as a path up the cliffs was concerned, but she slightly agreed with Florent. She was certain they could figure out a way to get all 6 of them up to Candlekeep.
"The changelings probably flew,"
she thought.
"and Pinky was probably talking about her spider climbing shoes. I can teleport. Only Applejack and Rarity will be a problem." "You're sailing all the way to Canterlot? Along the coast?" Rarity asked. Quick Fix nodded. "Our usual trade route is back and forth between Manehattan and Canterlot. We move specialty goods," she said. "So, smuggled goods," Applejack deduced. Rainbow affectionately bopped Applejack in the shoulder with a huff. "I'll give it a rest, AJ."
"I don't mind," Quick Fix said with a grin. "We're the best smugglers out there. But the main thing we offer is speed, and speed doesn't come cheap."
"I noticed,"
Twilight grumbled.
"and I've been told you can outrun sea serpents. To tell you the truth, with only a single mast, I'm skeptical."
Quick Fix smiled wryly. She stepped over to a hatch in the deck beside the mast and above one of the hulls. "Come here," she said, beckoning. Quick Fix opened the hatch and descended down a short ladder as Twilight trotted over. Twilight looked down through the hatch. Light from Quick Fix's horn illuminated the dim space down inside the hull. Along either side, crates were stacked, leaving a narrow pathway between them. At the bottom, a curved piece of metal rose up in the middle of the hull. "Come on down," Quick Fix said as she stepped off the ladder. Twilight hesitated a moment before climbing down the ladder. Inside the hull, the sound of waves lapping against the hull echoed in her ears. When she stepped off the ladder, Quick Fix said, "Down here is cargo," she said, picking up a wrench from atop a nearby crate. "And engineering." Twilight noticed that Quick Fix's mark was a wrench, roughly the same shape and size as the one she held in her magic.
Engineering?
She asked. Quick Fix used the wrench to open a panel in the curved steel. Twilight positioned beside Quick Fix in the tight space to see inside. Beyond the panel, she saw the interior of a cylinder filled with water and lined with sapphires. It hummed with faint arcane energy. "You may not believe it, but this is a jet propulsion engine from ages ago, and we've got two, one on each side. We only use the sails to get in and out of port. We keep it to the simple rigged lone mast so that Florent and I can operate it with just the two of us and split the profits 50-50, Quick Fix said.
"Oh, I believe you,"
Twilight said.
"This is like the one in the Manehattan Museum."
"I tried to tell them what it did, but they wouldn't listen. They called me crazy," she said. "Bunch of stuffy ivory tower scholars with no real experience." She shook her head. "So I keep it secret. If ponies knew how valuable this boat was, they would try and take it. We pay the Thieves Guild protection, though, so anyone that messes with us gets a little visit in the night." She eyed Twilight. "You're not going to mess with us, are you?" Twilight shook her head.
"I'm not going to cause you any problems. I may not be afraid of the Thieves Guild, but all I want is to get to Candlekeep as soon as possible."
Quick Fix closed the panel and fastened it shut. "Let's head back up then. Don't worry. We'll get you where you're going." Twilight climbed back up onto the deck with Quick Fix behind her. When she rejoined her friends, Applejack asked, "We good?" Twilight nodded.
"We're good. They'll get us there."
She turned to Quick Fix.
"When can we leave?"
"We cast off tomorrow morning at dawn o'clock," Quick Fix said. "Ride the tide out."
"That's not soon enough,"
Twilight thought.
"No. We're leaving now,"
she said. Quick Fix laughed. "No, we're not. Come back tomorrow." Twilight stepped toward Quick Fix, hardening her expression.
"Do you want us to pay more? I'm willing to do that."
She laced her magic around her swords.
"I said I wasn't going to cause you any problems, but if we don't leave now, we're going to have a problem. I'm getting to Candlekeep, and I'm getting there as soon as possible."
Quick Fix took a step back, fearfully glancing at Twilight's sword. Florent interposed himself into the gap with his drawn cutlass in one talon. "You do not threaten my crew, mademoiselle," he said. Twilight eyed him. A picture of a single stroke through his sword, through his neck, and through his spine formed in her mind. He'd be dead before he knew what was happening.
"No. I need him to sail the boat,"
she thought.
"Whoa, Twi!"
Rainbow said, moving to stand beside Florent.
"Hey, I'm all for getting there fast, but isn't this a bit much?"
Twilight snapped her focus to Rainbow Dash, glaring.
"Rainbow, right now, as we're sitting here talking, there are changelings in Candlekeep. There are demons in my home, stealing the souls and leeching off the emotions of the ponies I grew up with. There's only one reason I can think of that they would have gone there. To get to me. I already lost Star Sorrel. I'm not going to lose any pony else. We're leaving. Now. No matter what it takes." "It could be a trap,"
Rarity said.
"That's the first thing that occurred to me,"
Twilight said.
"But they'd think I'd head back to Candlekeep after the Black Knight's trail went cold. We figured out where they went, and they did everything in their power to cover their tracks. If we get there now, they won't be ready for us."
She kept her guard up, watching Florent warily for a moment. Quick Fix chuckled. I knew you weren't a bad sort. Now why didn't you lead with that? We'll cast off immediately. We'll have to skimp on a bit of maintenance. Starboard's been on the fritz, but I should be able to keep her running. I do think you owe me an apology, though. Twilight lowered her guard and fell back onto her haunches. She took a deep breath.
I'll get there when I get there,
she told herself.
I'm sorry,
she said.
It's just every time they're a step ahead of us. I don't want to waste any time, and I didn't think things through. I'm sorry.
Florent sheathed his cutlass and dipped his head respectfully. Yeah, what were you thinking? Quick Fix said with a laugh. I was about to point out that I'm the only one who can turn the jets on. You're not going anywhere in a hurry without me. Twilight expected to be seasick on her first voyage, but Solitaire's dual hulls cut through the waves like knives. She leaned against the bow railing, the wind whipping at her mane as they skimmed across the ocean. With air in her face, any queasiness she felt dissipated. According to Quick Fix, they were traveling at 25 knots, over twice the speed of the fastest recorded sailing ship, and they were doing it all without needing to rely on the temperament of the winds. The light of the setting sun glimmered on the peaks of the waves around her as they flashed past. Noticing an orange tint, she looked to the west and held up a hoof to keep her mane from blowing into her eyes. The sun dipped behind the cliffs of the Sword Coast in the distance. Florent had said they'd reach Candlekeep at around midnight. In mere hours, they were covering a distance that would take days to travel on foot. Twilight looked forward again and closed her eyes, relishing the speed.
Feels like you're flying, doesn't it?
Rainbow asked from behind her. Twilight opened her eyes and pushed off the railing, turning to face Rainbow.
I wouldn't know,
she said with a shrug.
Does it? Sorta,
Rainbow said.
I mean, it's not as good as the real thing.
She stretched out her wings.
I'd still be flying now, but the air patterns are different over the ocean. I'm beat.
Twilight smirked.
Hard to keep up with the boat?
Rainbow hoofed at the deck.
Maybe a little. Look!
Fluttershy cried out from the starboard railing.
I didn't know fishes could get that big.
Twilight smiled as she walked over. At first, Fluttershy had been nervous on the deck of the ship and had murmured fretfully about not knowing how to swim. She leaned against the starboard railing beside Fluttershy and peered out to sea. She saw a horizontal fluke slap the water a distance away.
That's not a fish,
she said.
That's a whale. See the way the tail fin is horizontal instead of vertical? Yep, whale.
Pinky agreed as she leaned against the railing on Fluttershy's other side.
You didn't get out much, did you? What's a whale?
Fluttershy asked.
A whale is a mammal that spends its entire life in the ocean.
Twilight explained.
A mammal?
Fluttershy said.
So it's like a squirrel or a bunny and it has milk and babies instead of eggs and all that? Does it breathe with gills?
The dark blue-black of the whale broke the surface, and a plume of seawater shot from its blowhole as they passed. It was huge for an animal, only slightly smaller than their boat.
I wonder if we'll see any of the really big ones.
Twilight thought.
Nope. Lungs. Their nostrils are on the top of their heads. Oh, this is so wonderful,
Fluttershy said, watching the whale with fascination.
I never learned anything about sea creatures. I wish I could just go out there and talk to them.
She leaned against Twilight.
Thank you so much. How do you know all these things?
Twilight smiled.
I grew up in a library.
She looked past Fluttershy at Pinky.
And unlike some ponies, I didn't get myself banned every other week, despite some ponies doing everything in their power to get me in trouble. I just couldn't handle the fun.
Pinky said with a laugh.
And I learned plenty. I don't even know how to read.
Fluttershy mumbled.
You don't know how to read?
Twilight shouted.
Hey, I don't know how to read either,
Rainbow said.
It's no big deal. Signs usually have pictures.
Twilight whirled on Rainbow.
What the How could you not know how to read?
Rainbow shrugged.
Lots of ponies don't know how to read. It's not exactly something they teach in flight school. They don't teach you how to read in Cloudsdale?
Twilight asked.
Nope,
Rainbow said.
I mean, administrators and officers have to learn, but it's not really an essential skill. What?
Twilight yelled.
Reading is absolutely an essential skill. Every pony should know how to read.
Not every pony grows up in a library, Twilight, Applejack said, approaching them from the quarterdeck. I'm lucky my granny insisted on teaching me. You really should learn if you get the chance, though, Rainbow. It's worth it.
Absolutely,
Rarity agreed.
it's certainly a handy skill.
Rainbow said, stretching.
Books are probably too slow for me anyway.
Twilight opened her mouth to respond, but the deck abruptly jolted beneath her feet, and she lost her balance. She tumbled over the canvas tarp covering the crates on the deck and nearly flew over the railing, but she managed to hook a foreleg around it before she went overboard. She saw a yellow blur in the corner of her eye and caught Fluttershy with her magic. 3 mares overboard! Applejack shouted. Twilight could see her through the railing supports, firmly planted in the center of the deck. Floating beside her, Fluttershy was frozen in terror, her wings pinned against her side. Angel clung tightly to her hair. Before dealing with her own predicament, Twilight set Fluttershy back on the deck. Starboard is out! Quick Fix called. The waves licked at her hind hooves.
I don't know how to swim!
Twilight thought as she looked around, gauging her situation. All she had learned was how to tread water in a small pond within the walls of Candlekeep. The strain in her foreleg was beginning to become unbearable. The boat was listing starboard, the right hull plowing into the waves. The port hull powered forward, driving the starboard one deeper beneath the surface. Her hind legs were fully submerged now, and soon they wouldn't be the only thing underwater. As abruptly as it had begun, it ended. The starboard hull bobbed up out of the water, and she nearly lost her grip at the sudden upward momentum. She grit her teeth and held on for dear life as she tried to focus enough to cast Dimension Door. Full stop! Quick Fix shouted. We're drifting! Gotcha, Twi, Applejack said as she appeared above. Pinky stepped up on the other side, and together they hoisted her back onto the deck. As they lifted her to her feet, she saw Rainbow deposit a soaking wet Rarity onto the middle of the deck.
Living, moving fishes touched me!
Rarity cried, shivering.
It was horrifying! I demand a refund!
Sorry, engine malfunction, Quick Fix said, poking her head up from the port hull. I'm gonna turn the port back on at half power. You ready with the rudder, Florent? She ducked back down below deck. Always, Florent called from the quarterdeck. All right, half power, Quick Fix yelled. Florent leaned on the steering wheel as Solitaire eased forward over the waves. The engine malfunction had faced them out to sea, and they cut a slow arc back to the correct heading. The deck shuddered beneath Twilight's hooves as the rudder struggled against the lopsided thrust. Quick Fix clambered out of the porthole and crossed to the starboard. All right, now let's see what the problem is. she said as she climbed down.
Thanks for catching me, Twilight,
Fluttershy said. Twilight nodded.
It was nothing.
She looked around at the deck, still rattled.
It wasn't nothing. I can't believe my wings locked up. I faced a dragon, Twilight, because he was, well, a great big meanie, and I had to, but I see a bunch of water and I can't even open my wings to save myself. I'm sorry. You shouldn't have had to catch me,
Fluttershy said. Twilight met her gaze.
Fluttershy, after all the times you've healed me, really, it was nothing.
Fluttershy nodded but glanced down at the deck. Suddenly, she looked up, past Twilight and off to starboard, toward the back of the ship.
Is that another whale?
Twilight turned and followed her gaze. She thought she saw a dark shape moving beneath the surface, casting a shadow many times larger than their boat. She squinted, trying to make it out.
I don't think so,
She murmured.
It's too big.
A claw broke the surface, clutching the body of the whale they had seen earlier. It lifted the massive creature free from the waves, water rushing off of it and splashing back into the sea. It rose ever higher, supported by a huge arm. A colossal head broke the surface nearby. A sinewy serpentine body covered in purple scales arched out of the waves behind it. "Sea serpent!" Florence shouted. "We've got to get moving!" The serpent's head rose out of the water, supported by a thick pillar of flesh and muscle. It shook the water from its golden mane. On its chest, between its two arms, it wore the barnacle-covered hull of a full-size sailing ship like a breastplate, lashed in place by countless rigging ropes. Sailcloth adorned its shoulders like the sleeves of a tunic. It lifted the whale to its mouth, and with a terrible crunch, bit off the animal's front half. "I'm working on it!" Quick Fix yelled. Twilight felt bile in the back of her throat as she watched blood and blubber drip from the serpent's lips. It chewed and swallowed, then looked down. Its huge eyes widened when it saw them. It dropped the back half of the whale, its meal forgotten. In a voice that rumbled like thunder, it said,
"Pretty boat, you're going to be my hat."
"Sounds like a big one! How long do we have?" Quick Fix shouted. The serpent started to move toward them, the sinews beneath its scales rippling. Along its length, Twilight made out ripples where its massive body undulated beneath the surface. Blood oozing from the tail end of the whale tinted the froth of the sea serpent's wake red. "Not long. At this speed, I'd say 30 seconds to serpent food," Florent replied. "Oh, uh-oh!" Quick Fix yelled. "What do you mean, uh-oh? I don't even know what the problem is yet!" Quick Fix cried. "By Celestia's thundering thighs, you'd better live up to your name in the next 25 seconds or we're all dead!" Florent roared. Twilight eyed the serpent. It was big, but sea serpent scales were not dragon scales. Sea serpents possessed no innate resistance to magic. A spell thrummed within the depths of her mind. She had learned it a long time ago from a book she had found in one of the dustiest corners of the archive. A book of death magic. It was more complex than even the improved haste spell, but somehow it felt like it had always been there, just waiting for the moment when she truly needed it. This spell did not care how big its target was. She had to form it from scratch, since she never had the opportunity or motive to prepare it. She made her way up the stairs of the quarterdeck at a measured pace, her horn lighting as she worked the magic. The components of the spell fell into place with ease, though she had to let go of 3 of her prepared spells to cast it. She walked across the quarterdeck and stopped at the stern railing. The sea serpent closed from behind, reaching out with a slow, ponderous claw. Its sheer mass made it sluggish. It was nothing but a giant target. As she worked on the next part of the spell, she weighed her options. If she hit it in the arm, the spell might not kill it, but the effect would be stronger if she hit it in the head.
If the spell doesn't kill it, it might make it retreat, or it might just make it mad,
she thought. 15 seconds! Florence shouted.
I'm not going to be able to fix it that fast!
Quick Fix replied.
Then it was a pleasure serving with you,
Florent yelled.
Just fly away!
Quick Fix pleaded.
The captain always goes down with his ship,
Florent shouted. Whatever you're gonna do, do it fast, Twilight, Applejack said from behind her, utterly calm.
She trusts me,
Twilight realized.
I can't take any risks. I can't let them down.
She finished casting, and a layer of overglow exploded around her horn as she held the spell. She made her choice.
Serpent! I am giving you a warning. If you do not turn away, you will die.
She bellowed at the top of her lungs.
Oh, pretty little pony. I hope you're as tasty as you are cute.
The serpent rumbled. Its claw drew ever closer. Twilight launched her spell. A black ray lanced out from her horn and struck the serpent in the jaw. For a brief moment, it merely looked stunned. Then its head exploded into a cloud of black ash. Decay rippled down the length of its body and along its arms. Mere hoofspans away from Twilight, its claw froze and crumbled away in the wind. The spell left no trace of its victim behind. The only thing that remained of the serpent was water surging into the space its body vacated, and a dark stain on the surface of the waves. Even the ship's hull at war wasn't left behind. Twilight felt a familiar rush. She hadn't killed since she fought the group of bandits alone. Unfortunately, even though the serpent was enormous, it still only felt like one.
This time it was completely justified,
she thought. She held no doubt, and that made it all the sweeter.
Holy sweet Celestia's rigid horn, what the hell was that?
Florence screamed, his accent mysteriously absent.
Disintegrate,
Twilight said. She turned away from the stern of the boat.
How long will it take to get going again?
She remembered when Starstroll discovered her reading the book she had found. He had seemed worried, but he didn't take it away from her. She had thought it was harmless. She never thought she'd even be able to cast the spells on those pages. As it turned out, it was easy.